Jackson Browne wrote life's little instruction book for his son beginning student life. It's a guidebook as practical as an umbrella. One example, never resist a generous impulse. Well, the book spawned lots of others. Some were humorous insights, like a 7-year-old who wrote, "I've learned that you can't hide a piece of broccoli in a glass of milk. The voice of experience speaks." Some lessons were much more serious. "I've learned that you can do something in an instant that will give you a heartache for life." Well, I want you to meet an 85-year-old man who had a good handle on life. Caleb's story appears in a few Bible passages, but our focus will be Joshua 14, verses 6 to 13. We can title his life, "How to Thrive Aged 85, but it applies to any age. Although old age is when you've got it all together, you just can't remember where you put it. Our society worships youth, not age. But how about this instruction from Leviticus 19:32? "Rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God." A man in his 50s was standing on a crowded airport bus. A gorgeous young woman sitting nearby made eye contact and smiled. He's thinking, well, I may be middle-aged, but I've still got it. And then she spoke. "Sir, would you like my seat?" Which kind of deflated him. Do you know, the Bible is pro-aging. Leviticus 27. "If anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving equivalent value, let the amount be set of a male between the ages of 20 to 60 at 50 shekels of silver. If it is a person 60 years or more, set the value at 15 shekels. So do you see, the idea of a senior discount comes from the Bible. Let's read now about Caleb, Joshua 14, verse 6. "Now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, 'You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, follow the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now, give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me will drive them out, just as he said." Then Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. A pastor tells of displaying a Christmas crib for carol services. After the celebrations, the doll representing Jesus went missing. Looking around the streets, he saw a boy riding a new bike with the Jesus doll propped up on the handlebars. He said, "Why did you steal the Jesus doll?" And the boy said, "I didn't. I asked God for a red bike at Christmas and said if I got it, I'd give his son a ride, and that's what I'm doing." Well, benefits come our way, and we can forget the God who enabled the blessings. Caleb never did. And he serves as a good example of some really important spiritual qualities. Do you know how the purpose of Jesus coming to earth that first time is summed up in John's Gospel? "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." If we're honest, we don't always live the Christian life as fully as we should. Well, there are 3 things Caleb never did. And so he lived life above the mediocre. And if we grasp what never to allow in our lives, it will free us to live life to the full. It really will. So, what should we never allow so we have Christianity to the full? First, never release God's promises. Look at Caleb's example. Life didn't start out too promising. Caleb wasn't a Jew. He was the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and they were not part of the Hebrew nation. Caleb was a foreigner. We don't know how he came to be enslaved in Egypt, but maybe we have a clue in his name. You see, Caleb means dog. Now, would you call your son or daughter dog? And to call someone a dog back then was a great insult. He may have been an unwanted child. That's bad, right? Wrong. It can be the best thing to happen depending upon what we make of it. When we're left alone, we learn to depend on God. And Caleb learned to use the scorn of others as a tool to grow stickability to God's promises. Moses promised property 45 years earlier. Since that promise, he spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness with a bunch of unfaithful, grumbling people. Then under Joshua's leadership, Caleb spent the past 5 years fighting as a soldier. Remembering God's promise, he says, "Now give me this hill country." Do you see? He never let go of that promise. When God gives a promise, never release it. Receive it. Has God given us a promise? No. He has given 7,457 promises. I know that some were specific to individuals in the Bible, but that doesn't rule most of them out. And an unclaimed promise of God is like not claiming a great prize. Do you know what's sadder than not claiming a great prize? Having the precious promises of God and not taking hold of them. But to claim God's promises, we must hook up to them. Just before World War II, in the town of Itasca, Texas, a school fire took the lives of 263 children. When the war ended, the town built a new school featuring what was called the finest sprinkler system in the world. 7 years later, in adding a new school wing, it was discovered that the sprinkler system had never been connected. That's a parable of what happens to many Christians. There is untold power available, but so many never hook up, and our lives are spiritually mediocre. Once we find a promise to us from God, never release it, even if you must wait 45 years for it to be fulfilled. And by the way, If you're looking for a promise from God to start the new year, I will give you one to hook up to that means a lot to me. In Ephesians 1, Paul is stacking up power synonyms in verses 19 and 20. Paul prays that we might experience God's incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is like the working of his mighty strength which he exerted in Christ when he raised him from the dead. Just look at the words in the promise. Power, dunamis is the word. We get dynamite from that word in our English, and it's used over 100 times in the New Testament. And there's the word working, derived from a Greek word meaning an inward energy or propulsion of power, and mighty strength, kratos, meaning ability to conquer, as when Rome conquered countries. And then there's strength, ischus, refers to physical force. The greatest display of this power was seen when God raised Christ from the dead. No created force could ever do this. Do we see God's incomparably great power is for us who believe? As Paul goes on to say in Ephesians 3 verse 20, we have this resurrection power through the Holy Spirit within us, so we can live life as we ought. The problem is, many never hook up. The system is in place, but it's dysfunctional because of ignorance or sin or disbelief. If we are not experiencing his power as we ought, Paul's prayer is that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know his incomparably great power for us who believe. Let's run our eyes over the last verses of Ephesians 1. This is a staggering promise. Perhaps we need to join Paul in his prayer that the eyes of our hearts will be opened so that we might glimpse his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power which brought about Jesus' resurrection, ascension and exaltation, displaying his lordship. Seeing this, we understand that because we are his body on earth as the church, and because he loves us so much that he considers himself incomplete without us, that power is operable on our behalf right now. There's only one thing necessary, and that's belief. Are we hooked up? Will we reckon on it? Will we say, Jesus, I believe? That's the kind of positive attitude we need. And by the way, if we have a negative attitude when we are 40, there's a good chance we will not have a negative attitude when we are 85. Because there's a good chance we won't be 85. You see, optimistic people have better health habits, better immune systems, and likely to live 10 years longer than people with negative attitudes. Caleb teaches us to never give up on God or his promises. God honours persistence. Joshua 13:1 says, when Joshua was old and well advanced in years, the Lord said to him, you are very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over. You'd expect God to say, you've done a good job. Take a rest and I'll use some of these younger men now. But God not only preserved the promise for the man, but God also preserved the man for the promise. 85 is an age when most people feel it's time to slow down. So this brings us to another great quality in life, and again spelt out in terms of what not to do. Never retire from God's service. Now, retirement from a career may be a good idea. You've earned it. Now go and spend your children's inheritance. Although the trouble with retirement is that you never get a day off. You ever thought about it like that? 6 times the Old Testament describes Caleb saying he wholeheartedly followed the Lord. And if we aren't following God with our whole heart, we're only half-hearted Christians. And half-hearted Christians are faint-hearted Christians. How about this for a song? Some to Jesus I surrender. Some to thee I freely give. I will mostly love and trust him, in his presence often live. I surrender some. Don't you think this song reflects too many churchgoers today? More importantly, does it reflect us? A century ago, Judson van Deventer wrestled with his life choices. He loved the arts and became an author, composer and artist. He felt that God was calling him to ministry. He said, "The pivotal hour of my life came and I surrendered all." He penned these famous words, "All to Jesus I surrender. All to him I freely give. I will ever love and trust him, in his presence daily live. I surrender all." Later, he joined Florida Bible Institute and helped mentor one of the greatest evangelists of all time, Billy Graham. Total surrender to God is an essential factor in our relationship with him. Following God with all our heart. We never retire from spiritual service. The word vocation comes from the Latin to call. And God has called all his children to serve him. It's our vocation. And we can't take a vacation from our vocation. God isn't through with us, whatever our age. There are probably plenty of jobs in our church to tackle. So keep serving, keep praying, keep available to God. I will never retire from serving God. I will never stop preaching the gospel as long as I have breath in my body and open doors to do it. As long as I have teeth, I'm going to chew on the devil. And even when I lose my teeth, I'm going to gum him to distraction. Maybe God gives us that sense within us we need to be about that too. May God give us the endurance that Caleb had at age 85. Out of the 2,930 individuals in the Bible, we only know the details of the lives of about 100. And do you know this? Only 1/3 finished well. Of the 2/3 that didn't finish well, most failed in the second half of their lives. Caleb is one of the minority who finished well. I hope this doesn't sound too dramatic, but I pray about my own death. I got the idea years ago when I was in Switzerland. I went into a small museum about the life of John Calvin. And I saw an artist's impression of him dying publicly, as they did back then. And he was pleading with people to go out with the gospel. He was dying well. And ever since then, usually at the turn of the year, I make this my prayer. Father, I don't know whether I will die this year, but if I do, I want to go well. Don't we all? It happens as we become spiritual Calebs. There are all kinds of stories about spiritual Calebs. I'll tell you one. Evelyn Brand was born in England in 1879 and grew up in a wealthy family. She was converted to Christ, married and went with her husband as missionaries in a mountain range in India. After about 10 years, her husband died, aged 44. She came home beaten down by grief. After a year's restoration, and against advice, she returned all by herself to India, nursing the sick, rearing orphans, clearing jungle land, pulling teeth, establishing schools, spreading the gospel. Age 67, she fell and broke her hip. Her son, Paul Brand, a surgeon, encouraged her to retire. She said, "If I leave, who will help the village people? Who will treat their wounds and pull their teeth and teach them about Jesus? When someone comes to take my place, then and only then will I retire." Are we getting older? Of course. In fact, we're all a few minutes older than when I began talking. Actually, this is the oldest I've been. Just never retire. Don't hang on to a job when it's time to make way for someone else, but keep serving our Lord. But a third key quality we learn from Caleb is never retreat from our enemies. Caleb was a brave soldier at 40 and just as courageous at 85. And following the Lord with our whole heart, we will never back up, shut up or give up until we're caught up to heaven. The Israelites had to conquer their grasshopper complex. You see, 45 years earlier, Moses sent 12 spies into the promised land to check it out, to investigate. 10 reported giants in Canaan. Numbers 13:33, we saw the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. 10 spies suffered from a grasshopper complex. Actually, they were half right. They did look like grasshoppers in their own eyes, but to the Canaanites they didn't look like grasshoppers, but a mighty army. According to Rahab, the prostitute who became a princess, the people had been trembling in fear of the Israelites for 40 years. We may be suffering from a grasshopper complex, thinking we're too little or too insignificant to matter. If we hear you can't do it enough, we say it to ourselves enough, we may begin to believe it. So before claiming God's promises and living in the land of victory, we must overcome the grasshopper complex. We must have Caleb's attitude. He didn't deny that there were giants. Instead, he said that these giants would be bread for us. They would have them for lunch. The wimpy spies were whining, "Look how big those giants are compared to us." Caleb said, "Look how small those giants are compared to God." God removed 603,548 men of Israel during their wilderness wanderings in the desert. Why did they die? Because they refused to mix God's promises with faith. Caleb and Joshua were different. And now Caleb says, "Here I am today, 85 years old. I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go to battle now as I was then. Now, give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day." Question: what's the toughest battle to win against an enemy? On flat ground or against an enemy in fortified cities up in the hill country? Hill country is the toughest, right? Caleb asked for the hardest challenge. Interestingly, Researchers on aging have found challenges are required to keep our brain healthy. God has wired us so that our bodies and minds require challenges. And most of the giants we face are ones we create in our own life. When it comes to spiritual victory, the old comic strip character Pogo was right. We have met the enemy, and he is us. I agree. Do you know the person in the church that I have more trouble with than anybody else? It's my wife's first husband. That guy really bugs me. Just to make this clear, my wife has only been married once. I am her first husband. In Joshua 15 and verse 14, we read about 3 giants Caleb fought. Now remember, names were more than just identifying labels. They carried meaning. Let's meet these 3 giants. From Hebron, Caleb drove out the 3 Anakites. Sheshai, that name means who I am. Ahiman, that name means what I am. And Talmai, which means what I can do. And before we can claim victory, we have to face and fight the same 3 giants. Who I am, that's our ego. What I am, that's the enemy of pride. And what I can do, which is the enemy of self-sufficiency. There are other giants on the outside, but we'll never be successful against the external giants until we learn to defeat those 3 internal giants. And when we follow the Lord with our whole heart like Caleb, we will be willing to face any giant. Facing troubles in Borneo in 1964, the Nepalese soldiers called Gurkhas were known for their valour. The British command asked a squad of Gurkhas if they would be willing to jump out of an aeroplane into combat against the enemy. After discussing it for a moment, the Gurkha sergeant replied, "Yes, we will jump out if the aeroplane will fly as slow as possible, only 100 feet above the swamp." The British commander said, "But that's too low. Your parachutes wouldn't have time to open." The Gurkha sergeant said, "Oh, you didn't mention parachutes." Now that's courage, willing to jump out of an aeroplane without parachutes. The secret is utilizing the strength of the Lord for us. Paul wrote, "Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." In our own strength, full of ourselves, we are as helpless as a newborn kitten. But depending on God's strength, we have all the power of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We may face an uncertain future, but remember, the word impossible is not part of God's vocabulary. So a word that you might like to focus upon as we move into this new year is not the word impossible, but opportunity. It is impossible in our strength, but claim this promise: I can do everything through him who gives me strength. So let's take to heart these lessons from Caleb. Don't we want to get into the abundant life Christ makes possible? Never release God's promises. Never retire from God's service, and never retreat from our enemies. Following God wholeheartedly and depending on his strength, we will thrive aged 85 or whatever age we are. If God can do that for an old man, just think what he can do with us. About Evelyn Brand, I'll finish the story. She spent 20 years of widowhood in India. When 70 years old, she gets word from the mission office in England they are not going to give her another 5-year term. She is getting too old. She had a party celebrating her time in India. Everybody cheered and said, "Have a good trip back home." She said, "I'm staying in India." She rode from village to village on horseback to tell people about Jesus for 5 years on her own. One day she fell off and broke her hip. She is 75 years old. Her son says, "Mum, God used you. It's time to go back home." She said, "I'm not going." She spent another 18 years travelling from one village to another on horseback. Falls, concussions. She's 93 years old and can't ride horseback now. And for 2 years, the men in those villages, because they loved her, they carried her on a stretcher from one village to another. God, I want to be wholehearted for you. That's finishing well. It might be a story that gets told. It may not. Nobody may know about it but you and God. It doesn't matter. God, we want to have another mountain and let people see that Jesus is everything, that Jesus is enough. That's living life to the full. And it doesn't stop at the grave, but goes on for eternity. That's who God made us to be. I'm not going to spend my life. I'm going to invest it in what will outlast it. How about you? We are to be too blessed to be stressed. God bless you as we move into this new year.